The war that scorched the globe did not begin in Europe's cold fields, nor over the skies of Britain, nor across the Pacific's island chains. Before the world fully woke to thunder in Poland or fire in Pearl Harbor, another land had already tasted the steel of empire and the cries of conquest. A land ancient and proud, where kingdoms once rose from golden dunes, and caravans cut silent trails beneath an endless sky. That land was Africa. This is the story of battles rarely told in classrooms, of warriors who marched in bare feet and torn sandals, of camels loaded with machine guns, of kings in exile and empires desperate to survive, of deserts where bones turned to dust, and jungles where disease killed more men than bullets ever could. This is the forgotten war, within the greatest war humanity has ever known. A saga buried beneath European headlines. A battlefield that shaped the fate of nations, yet remains a whisper in history's halls. Our story begins not with world powers, but with a smaller nation fighting for its very soul. Ethiopia, 1935. While Europe watched with tense breath as Germany rearmed, another empire sharpened its blade. Italy, frustrated, humiliated by its failure to conquer Ethiopia decades earlier, sought redemption through blood. And so Benito Mussolini unleashed a force of 500,000 men toward the highlands of East Africa. Opposing him, Emperor Haile Selassie, sovereign of the only African state never colonized. A symbol of resistance, of dignity. The Italian columns moved like steel rivers across the plains. They brought tanks, artillery, and poison gas. A crime of war the world condemned, yet did nothing to stop. Ethiopian warriors rode out with rifles as old as their grandfathers, brandishing spears, swords, and unbroken pride. The air filled with the roar of engines and the whisper of prayer. Peasant fighters in white robes charged through mustard gas clouds, coughing blood, but refusing surrender. They carried crosses, not gas masks. Hope, not armour. Weeks turned to months, towns fell, thousands died. And yet the heart of Ethiopia refused to break. Selassie, forced into exile, carried his nation's grief to the League of Nations, pleading not only for his kingdom, but for the soul of justice itself. His voice trembled not with weakness, but with prophecy. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow. Europe listened, then did nothing. Ethiopia burned, but its story would not end there. Years later, when the world finally exploded into global war, that unanswered cry returned like thunder. The British and Commonwealth forces, South Africans, Indians, Nigerians, Ghanaians, Kenyans, and men from across the empire, marched back across the Horn of Africa. Selassie rode at the head of soldiers who had never forgotten their homeland. The Free French under Leclerc joined them. From harsh mountains to steaming valleys, Ethiopian patriots, Arbegnok, the shifter freedom fighters, bled the Italians dry. Town by town, hill by hill, they reclaimed their soil. Addis Ababa rose in celebration as Selassie finally returned in 1941. Africa had spoken. Empires could fall. Freedom could be won. But that was only the beginning. Far across the continent another front burned. The Sahara, vast, ancient, indifferent. In this ocean of sand, armies moved like ships, their steel hulls half buried in dunes, their tracks etching scars across endless emptiness. Here the British Commonwealth, Australians, Indians, South Africans, met the armoured claws of Germany's Afrika Korps, led by Rommel, the Desert Fox, whose daring manoeuvres and sudden strikes earned him both fear and admiration. Yet the desert had no favourites. Heat-cooked fuel, sand ground gears to dust. Soldiers woke with scorpions crawling across their chests, drank water warm as blood, and dug trenches not against winter frost, but blowing fire and grit. Bedouin tribes watched ancient lands shake beneath modern war. Italian forts crumbled beneath shellfire. And across this blazing arena, African labourers, guides, scouts, and soldiers toiled and fought, unseen by history's lens. In Nigeria, families waved goodbye to sons marching under foreign flags. In Kenya, young men were conscripted, some willingly, others under colonial pressure. Their courage unquestionable, yet their sacrifice rarely honoured. From the Gold Coast to Rhodesia, they trained under a hot sun, learning the tools of modern war. Some marched in barefoot discipline, rifles slung with quiet pride. Others loaded ammunition crates, repaired trucks, or carried the wounded through malaria-haunted bush. Their reward? A uniform, a few coins, and a promise that freedom someday would reach them too. The desert churned with steel. Battles erupted like storms, Bardia, Mersa Matruh, Tobruk. At Tobruk, Commonwealth troops, including African pioneers, held fast for months under constant siege. Rommel attacked again and again, yet they endured. Dust-caked, hungry, exhausted, but unbroken. Their stand became legend. And as tanks clashed and aircraft roared, another war took place beneath the canopy of Central Africa. Belgian Congo, a land of unimaginable wealth carved open by colonial greed, became a silent giant of Allied supply. Uranium from its mines would one day help forge the most devastating weapon mankind had ever known. Copper, rubber, gold, extracted by African labourers working under harsh conditions, fueled factories oceans away. War is not only fought with guns. It is built on sweat, on hands that mine, harvest, carry, and bleed. Africa carried more than weapons. It carried the weight of empires. Yet the jungle frontages saw blood too. In Abyssinia's green highlands, in the thick forests of East Africa, soldiers suffered not only bullets but tsetse flies, malaria, dysentery. Men collapsed not from fear, but fever. A single mosquito could kill where 1,000 bullets could not. But they marched on, guided by local fighters who knew the land better than any map. Then came Madagascar, an island forgotten even by war's geography. In 1942, the Allies, fearing Japanese expansion and German U-boats, invaded the Vichy-controlled island. It was a strange campaign. British soldiers wading through mangrove swamps, facing French troops and Malagasy defenders caught between loyalty and survival. The jungle swallowed sound. Villages burned. And on that lonely island, men died in a battle few outside military archives remember. Africa was not just a stage. It was a crucible. And as the war raged, a quiet truth took root across the continent. If Africans could bleed for freedom abroad, why should they accept chains at home? In barracks and trenches, whispers grew. From Accra to Nairobi, from Lagos to Lusaka, returning veterans carried new ideas: equality, nationalism, dignity. They had seen Europe humbled. They had fought alongside white soldiers as comrades, and they returned believing in a world no longer ruled by empires. The seeds of independence movements, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, were planted in the muddy boots of African soldiers marching home. But our story is not yet finished. For even as the Reich fell and victory flags rose, Africa's role faded into wartime myth. Medals were awarded sparingly, history books glanced aside. And yet, beneath quiet graves, in desert sand and mountain soil, the truth endures. Africa fought, Africa suffered, Africa rose. These were not silent soldiers. They were heroes in dust-covered boots, in patched uniforms, in tribal wraps beneath helmets too large for their heads. They fought under flags not their own, yet dreamed of one that one day would be theirs. And so we remember them. The Askari marching beneath burning skies. The Ethiopian warriors charging through clouds of poison. The Kenyan Kalia Corps hauling artillery through disease-ridden valleys. The Nigerians defending desert fortresses. The Senegalese tirailleurs standing tall at Italian strongholds. The Gold Coast gunners holding the line in East Africa. The freedom fighters who bled for a future they had yet to see. This war shaped nations. It forged destinies. And though the world forgot, the land remembers. The dunes still whisper. The mountains still echo. The savannah still carries the ghost steps of men who gave everything and asked for nothing. Africa was not a bystander. Africa was a battlefield, a proving ground, a birthplace of freedom movements that would reshape continents. And as the guns of Europe thundered, Africa stood, silent, proud, and unyielding. A continent of warriors, the stage of forgotten fire. For in the shadows of sand and savannah, the world was changed forever. Yet, even as these battles raged across dunes, jungle valleys and mountain ridges, the world's gaze drifted elsewhere, to the blitzed cities of Europe, to the frozen steppes of Russia, to the carrier fleets clashing across the Pacific. Africa's war became a footnote, its heroes folded into silence. But here, in the heart of the continent, history was quietly changing. As Rommel's Afrika Korps tightened its grip on North Africa, Cairo felt the tremor of danger. British command understood. If Egypt fell, the Suez Canal, lifeline of empire, would fall next. And so, convoys of troops from across the Commonwealth streamed north. Among them marched thousands of African soldiers, Nigerians, Sudanese, Ghanaians, Somalis, Eritreans, eyes forward, boots thudding to an ancient rhythm of duty and pride. Alongside them came men of India, Sikhs in turbans beneath the scorching sun, Gurkhas with kukuris strapped to their belts, Hindustani soldiers marching in dusty determination. Africa became a meeting ground of worlds, east, west, and the vast beating heart of its own soil. El Alamein, the desert bulged with tension. Rommel, the desert fox, brilliant, relentless, hungry for victory. Facing him the Allied command, brittle at first, learning through defeat, until one voice steadied the line. General Bernard Montgomery. But victory would not come from great names alone. It came from the silent labour of African porters hauling crates through blistering heat, from Sudanese machine gunners holding lonely ridges, from Nigerian engineers laying road across shifting dunes. The battle erupted in fire and fury. Shells painted the night sky white. Tanks roared, burned, melted under sun and steel. And when the dust finally settled, Rommel's advance was broken. The tide turned. Had Africa fallen, the war might have turned with it. But it did not. And because of that, the world would change. As Allied columns pushed west, through Libya and Tunisia, Italian troops faltered, and German units pulled back. In Tunisian villages, women peeked out from stone doorways as columns of tanks rumbled past, some bearing the black cross of the Wehrmacht, others the white star of the Allies. The sounds of war rolled through olive groves and ancient ruins. Yet beneath the chaos, something deeper stirred. Africans watched empires clash and realized empires could bleed. War destroys more than armies. It uproots life itself. In the Congo, labourers work to exhaustion in mines whose wealth would help end the war, but would never make their communities rich. In Kenya, families waited months, sometimes years, for sons who marched north and never returned. In Senegal, tirailleurs shipped across oceans to fight for France returned to discrimination and broken promises, seeds of anger that would bloom into resistance. Disease stalked the camps: malaria, typhoid, dysentery, silent enemies that claimed more lives than bullets. In the jungles of East Africa, soldiers scratched at fevered skin beneath mosquito nets, whispering prayers into humid night. And civilians, caught between armies, hungry, frightened, bore scars without medals. Farmers saw fields trampled by convoys. Nomads found grazing lands closed by barbed wire. Entire communities shifted like dust in the wind. A continent sacrificed. A world seldom thanked it. The war's most unusual chapter unfolded far from desert sands, on Madagascar, where British and Commonwealth forces moved to prevent Axis control. Jungle mud clung to boots. Mosquitoes whined in the still air. Malagasy fighters, caught in colonial rivalries not their own, faced impossible choices. It was a struggle few newspapers reported. No grand speeches, no iconic photographs. Yet in the shadows of that lush island, men fought and died for strategic ground most outsiders could not find on a map. War does not need witnesses to be real. Blood spilled is never forgotten by the soil. Then, slowly, like dawn rising, the war turned. Italy collapsed. Germany retreated. The Allies surged forward. And one by one, African soldiers returned home. Some walked for days along railway lines. Others stepped off steamers with duffel bags worn by distance and time. They returned to villages where children did not recognize them, to wives and mothers who wept with joy and grief together, to fields that had grown wild in their absence. They returned not as boys, but as men forged in the furnace of war, disciplined, worldly, unafraid. They had seen the fortress of empire from inside. They had fought not as subjects, but as soldiers. And they carried with them an idea more powerful than any rifle. If we can fight for them, we can fight for ourselves. In Ghana, a veteran named Kwame Nkrumah stirred hearts with the dream of independence. In Kenya, returning soldiers and workers, disciplined, organized, would form the backbone of a struggle for freedom. In Nigeria, veterans marched in organized protests, demanding the dignity they had earned in blood. Across Tanganyika, Uganda, Senegal, Zambia, everywhere the war travelled, the idea of liberty took root. Colonial powers had armed men to fight fascism abroad, only to discover they had empowered them to fight injustice at home. And so the wind of change began to blow. Quiet at first, like a whisper over long grass. Then growing into a storm that would sweep the continent in the decades to come. Before the world burned in Europe, before tanks scarred the sands of Egypt, before aircraft roared across Pacific skies, there was a march through jungle, river, and mountain, silent, harsh, and forgotten by time. It did not begin with kings and generals, nor with parades or speeches. It began with ordinary men from Congo, miners, farmers, fishermen, workers, who suddenly found themselves called to arms for a war not of their making. They came from villages along the Congo River, where water flowed like a living vein through the heart of Africa. They came from mines carved by sweat and forced labour under Belgian rule. They came from towns where drums beat at sunset and children played beneath palm trees swaying in the humid breeze. They came barefoot, thin, strong, and uncertain, yet burning with a quiet, stubborn pride. When Europe fell into madness, Belgium was crushed under German boots. The colonial administrators fled to London, but the Congo remained, a forgotten corner of a collapsing empire, holding one thing the Allies desperately needed: manpower, raw strength, human steel. And so the Force Publique, the Congolese colonial army, was mobilized. Officers Belgian, soldiers African, their pay small, their rations modest, their boots sometimes absent, but their spirit unbreakable. News arrived from the high mountains of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, a proud African empire suffering under Italian occupation. Haile Selassie, driven from his throne by Mussolini's ambition, sought allies to reclaim his homeland. And in response, Men from West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, and deep in Central Africa, answered. Among them were the Congolese, men who had been ruled, beaten, taxed, ordered, yet marched willingly toward a different fight, a fight that, while wrapped in European command, carried an echo of something older, deeper. One African land helping another reclaim its crown. Trains rattled through dense rainforest, carrying troops towards distant front lines. Boats pushed slowly across muddy rivers choked with reeds and crocodile glare. The heat clung to skin like a second layer, thick and suffocating. Mosquitoes hummed at dusk like invisible predators. Yet they marched, rifles on shoulders, hearts steady, unknowing what waited beyond the horizon. From Leopoldville to Stanleyville, from jungle outposts to dusty railheads, from river ports to Red Sea shores. And then they landed in East Africa, setting foot on a land where mountains rose like stone titans and air turned thin with altitude. This was not the steaming jungle they knew. This was Ethiopia, vast, ancient, wounded. Here Italian fortresses dotted ridges, machine gun nests scraped into rock, roads snaked up cliffs like ribbons of dust. The enemy had tanks, artillery, aircraft, the tools of mechanized empire. The Congolese had grit, rifles, stubborn lungs, and a commander who believed in them. They marched in long columns through narrow mountain paths, breathing thin air that burned their lungs. They crossed rivers cold as steel. They built makeshift bridges from trees cut by machete. They pushed supply mules through ravines where one misstep meant death. The locals watched them pass, old men squinting from stone doorways, women clutching small children, herders pausing on hillsides. They saw men dark like them, marching under foreign flags, yet carrying, unknowingly, the shared sense of destiny. They reached the Italian outposts, cold stone walls built into mountainsides, bristling with barbed wire and guns. These were not simple fights. They were sieges sculpted by hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. The Congolese soldiers dug trenches into rock, their fingers raw and bleeding. At night they shivered under blankets too thin for the highland chill. At dawn, they sharpened bayonets and waited for orders. And orders came. Charge positions up steep slopes, cut enemy supply lines, hold ridges under artillery fire. Guard captured ground against counterattack. They did not shout battle cries. They fought as they lived, silently, steadily, with the patience of river and stone. Their bullets cracked through crisp mountain air, their boots crushed frost-covered grass. Their sweat and blood blended with soil that had seen empires rise and fall for centuries. In one forgotten valley, a Congolese platoon, outnumbered, low on ammunition, held a mountain pass through an entire night against repeated Italian assaults. When dawn broke, they still stood, weary, bruised, hungry, but unbroken. When they advanced into towns freed from Italian rule, Ethiopian patriots and villagers greeted them with tears and ululations. Selassie's supporters blessed them, bringing water, bread, dried meat. They saw not colonized Africans in foreign uniforms, but brothers. And in those moments, beneath a rising African sun, The truth shimmered like heat on horizon. Africa was not a pawn in someone else's war. Africa was a force, fragmented by history, but united in sacrifice. The Congolese eventually returned home, not with parades or medals, but quietly, through the same thick jungles and river ports from which they left. Some brought scars, some brought malaria, some did not return at all, lost beneath Abyssinian soil, far from the river songs of home. Those who survived came back changed. They had seen mountains kiss the sky in Ethiopia. They had seen empire falter. They had marched with allies from lands they never imagined. They had fought not only for Belgium, but for dignity, for connection, for something history would try to forget. In Congo they found mines still consuming men, fields still worked under colonial gaze, tax collectors still waiting, indifferent to medals or wounds. The empire welcomed their service with silence, but they carried something powerful, a quiet knowing. They had fought in a global war. They had stood as soldiers, not servants. They had proven their worth, to others, to themselves. And in the coming decades, when whispers of independence stirred, when students protested, when workers organized, when leaders rose with voices calling for freedom, the memory of far-off mountains, of comrades fallen, of a war survived, became fuel. They were no longer subjects. They were veterans. They had marched across a continent for a cause greater than any government ever saw. And though history turned its head, time remembers. For the rivers of Congo still flow. The jungle still breathes. The mountains of Ethiopia still stand in silent honor of those who came from far away to help reclaim a throne. And somewhere in the wind between Kinshasa and Addis Ababa, in the quiet rustle of palm leaves and the echo of distant church bells in highland air, the spirit of those forgotten soldiers whispers, "We marched, we fought, we endure." Fade out over mist rising from the Congo River. A heartbeat drum begins. Archival silhouettes fade into water and mountain sky.